Welcome to Venice Views. I'm Pam Johnson, Marketing and Communications Officer for the City of Venice, and today we have an interview with another old-timer from Venice, somebody who's been here for a long time, whose family came here in the early days, and who had a great influence by and of the great train depot that we have here in Venice that was so much part of our history. And we are here in the freight room today talking to Grady Hough. Grady, welcome to Venice Views. And the first thing I want to ask you about is your family has been in Florida for a long time. How long?
Well, thank you, Pam. Yes, well, Dad was born on a turpentine still, which is now Ocala. So his folks originally came from Georgia, but he was born in North Florida, spent his whole life in Florida. I was born in Fort Myers and more than a few years ago, back pre-World War II. So I've seen a lot of railroad stations, and the old coal smoke and cinders are sort of in the blood in the background.
Yeah, you went from station to station with him. So he started, when you were born, he was in Fort Myers. So tell me a little bit about the progression that led him to Venice.
He worked in Fort Myers as the agent for the Seaboard Railroad, starting in, I guess, about the early 30s, and of course he was there when the World War II broke out. Fort Myers had two military bases. They had a lot of German submarines out around, so one of those bases flew out planes that would occasionally knock off a German submarine. And then he bid in a job over in Central Florida, a little place called Alturas, which was a way station between Westlake, Wales and Bartow, Winter Haven.
So I have a little souvenir here from your days in Alturas, was it?
Well,
and this is...
That would be in the new elementary school. And that was, I believe, in Alturas where I got my Eagle Scout, and I guess I had just 13 and a half. I got 13 and a half, I guess. And Dad was pinning the badge on him. There's another picture somewhere around where, at that time, the adult scout leaders could also work on this, so I'm pinning the Eagle Scout badge on him. But he was a major influence on a lot of the young lads there. That kept a lot of kids, I can't say off the street because there weren't a whole lot of streets in Alturas. But he loved his football too. We'd go into on Friday night during football season, he'd drive a whole carload of us into the high school football game in Bartow. When we moved here, he came in late '48, and I finished junior high school in Bartow, and then we moved here in June of 48. They had, 49 rather. They had no football here. So one of the things he did in his spare time, he interested a number of other men in the community to let's get a football team in Venice. So they raised money, and in the fall of '50, we had the first modern day football team. It was a six-man team. They'd had football teams here off and on, but they had trouble fielding 11 men, and of course in those days, unlike today, there was no districts. There was just individual schools, and they played in conferences.
So who was on that first team?
I was on the first team, yes.
Yeah, and who else? Do you remember some of your other teammates?
Well, yes, Dave Pattison, who's now a retired funeral director, Jerry Brobst, who's retired, living in Fort Myers, Bud Leadham, whom we see occasionally. I think he lives in Inglewood. He's sort of a recluse. Dickie Taylor, who's deceased, and Francis Schramm, who's deceased, and Jack Goff, who's deceased, and Jack Pearson, who's deceased, and I guess there are only about half a dozen of us left.
But those were the first football players here.
And I found in the archives, I found some pictures of teams back in the 30s or whatever. In fact, one of them, they didn't even have uniforms on. They had civilian normal clothes on. But they had trouble, getting enough people to play 11-man ball and to find people to play. We started our first 11-man game. Dad got to MC the induction. When they had the lights right behind where what used to be Smitty's. Now I
Pineapples.
Pineapples. I can't remember some of the new
All
names,
of the names.
but right behind that was the baseball field, which we converted over to the football field, which was called Washburn Field. Bill Washburn was the president.
Would that be where the gondolier is now, or a little bit in between?
The gondolier probably sits on where the original airfield was.
Okay.
They brought the airfield, that was again before the inland waterway. Didn't have to go across a bridge to go downtown. So Dad did a lot of secondary work besides working with the Scouts here also. The creation of the football team, he loved his football. He said he was, when he was in high school, he went out for football, but they wanted to use him as the tackling dummy. And that ended his football career. He went on to play baseball in the various leagues around. But as far as the depot is concerned, this essentially was a 7-day-a-week job, although he didn't have to work 12 hours a day here like he did in Fort Myers. There are things I look around here now that I see enough similarity to what it was back then. They obviously did not have the floor varnished. It was very basic wood, and if you weren't careful, if you walked barefoot, you'd get splinters in your feet.
And this was the freight room where you all loaded and
this was the freight room.
unloaded.
There were and the two doors out back. One had another platform just below it, so you didn't go when you had a smaller pickup truck. You would take the stuff and make the first hump, and then it was a lower hump to get to the bed of the pickup truck. That's where when we were carrying the freight, the Railway Express, the citrus fruit over and loading it the night before because there was such an abundance of it. The train didn't come over until about 8 o'clock, and we had 20 minutes to get everything loaded. If we had 100 half-bushel baskets, it was difficult to do in that time, so we did it the night before. We would use the two-step. The other one was where they'd back a bigger truck up, where the back end of the truck would be more level. We could just scoot right off into it.
So when you came here, you were just starting high school.
I started as a freshman.
That's kind of a traumatic time sometimes for kids to make a move. What did you think about Venice when you first got here?
Well, after Alturas, it was, you might say, a big city. Dick and Metta's drugstore, and anyway, what did I think? I thought, this is where I am. And it really wasn't that much of a transition. The high school here, which was in Nokomis at that time, was even smaller than the junior high school where I was in Bartow. I mean, Bartow was a big city versus what Venice was. Of course, when I went from Alturas, we got bused into Bartow. That again was the big city. Right. We had to wear shoes to school. But as far as the railroad, Dad never, he mentored me in a way that I didn't even know he was, managed me, I guess is the word. I didn't even know I was being managed. He would, so I'd say, Daddy, there's nothing to do. Well, I'll find something for you to do. I won't like what you want for me to do. I learned how to do the waybills on the Railway Express. They had lots of tariffs on the freight, so I never learned how to determine the billings on the freight. I never sold passenger tickets. There weren't that many passenger tickets. But I wore out a few brooms sweeping up things, break up the ice and put it in the cooler, empty the cooler from the day before, clean toilets and all the other things. So just a couple of the funny stories that came up. One night I pulled the dolly up and the Railway Express. One of the guys, he threw me a box like it was very heavy and it only weighed about a quarter of a pound. And I'm braced to take this big heavy basket, almost fall off the back end. And one of the learning experiences was those dollies, only the front wheels turn, and they would turn at 90 degrees. If they're loaded down, one does not turn them 90 degrees. Well, I was trying to get one out on a shortcut, and I turned it, it was loaded with half-bushel baskets, bushel baskets, and fortunately not too many of the 90-pound boxes. And when I turned that thing, it was raining boxes. So I'm laying down there underneath the pile, my pants half torn off, with the boxes over the top of me, and we had just finished converting, the city had converted the hospital from what is now the regional med converting it from a apartment house into the hospital. So I go in there, my pants are half torn off, and there are 3 people sitting in the chairs they had in the emergency room. No more chairs, so I sat on the stairway until they came and x-rayed me to make sure I had broken no bones from that. But again, a learning experience. You do not, and I knew better than that. Just like most, then I must have been 16, 17. And when I'd come back from college in the summer, until he retired, I'd come back and I would work down here. Kept me out of trouble. I guess between the railroad station and athletics, I didn't have time to get into too much trouble.
Well, I can't even imagine so much trouble being here in Venice to get into, but I'm sure young kids can find it, create it.
A tough day in Venice, or if somebody smoked a cigarette, or maybe had a beer.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, now tell me about the daily life at the depot. What kind of day did your dad put in? What did he do?
I can only go by, I guess, osmosis. If it was the manual labor, I got to do it. And little by little, he'd teach me certain things, and I learned early on if I didn't want to do it, I needed to stay busy elsewhere. Because he never, taught me how to figure the tariff charges on freight. I mean, there were 2 or 3 big books of what, in the event that it's this item, you charge it this and whatever. But I could do the tariff book on the Railway Express and make up the way bills. But he would have the day either visiting the local, then the lumber companies also had concrete. Literal concrete, I think that was before we had the concrete company. That was the back end of where Johnson Lumber was. Johnson Lumber had a fire and it got burned down. And again, going back to, was that when I was in high school or was that after I got out? It all blends together, Pam.
Right.
After a while, but the average day was sort of mundane after the train was out and before it came back in. It would be a matter of checking with the various carload shippers to make sure they were all happy with their lumber or whatever it was, arranging for cars if somebody was going to ship out pulpwood or stumps. The stumps, I think they shipped to Hercules Powder Company. I don't know how they converted the stumps, the pine sap in those into dynamite. I don't really know how they did that. I never got that far along. But seeing that the cars were available, this is freight cars, were available for the local builders, building community, the lumber companies, the stuff that came in, making sure that the people were appropriately notified, making out the bills of lading that went along. The passenger traffic wasn't that much. A few people would go up and back. And as I say, the train went to Tampa where it made one switch, and then it went up a little further, Wildwood. It went to Wildwood, and that's where it met the train coming up from the East Coast. But during the day, during the down times when he wasn't on the telegraph machine, he had one that was left and right. You use your thumb and your finger. I never learned to use that. I mean, you could, if you're doing dots, you just hold it down and go da 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 da, like a machine gun. I never used. I had the flat surface key. That's the only one I could use. But the key, this was just railroad. It wasn't like an Alturas where he was also the Western Union. Paperwork, oh yes, there was paperwork. Every bureaucracy has its paperwork. He had all these ideas about how things could be improved, and he'd ship them up the line to the bureaucracy. And I asked him years later, I said, Dad, did the railroad implement all those things? He says, yeah, finally, after I retired, they finally got implemented. He had this great big desk. I don't know if it's like or unlike the one that the DeCosters had here. All of his stuff, after he left here, he stayed in transportation. He worked in the moving van business for years, and the desk and everything else that when he sold the moving van business shortly before he died, he had some pictures, one of a railroad agent. In fact, I've seen it again. Apparently it's in the other presentation on the old railroad station. They had that same picture. So he had that picture on the wall, but the fellow that bought the transportation agency, I went down there one day to check, and he said, I threw out all that junk, which would have been the key, telegraph key, the picture of the railroad station, and other assorted things.
Was it either one of these?
Oh, that is, I say, that's when he was, he had just had all of his teeth pulled out and he hadn't gotten the replacement teeth. So he was, they didn't have the fluoridated water back in the old days that they have these days. But let's see if I can see in here the telegraph key that's left and right. I don't know, I can't make it out. But they had that's the regular key. Yeah, I think, no, that's like the simplified key there. But that was to the right. This is looking out the wall, facing the railroad track. The desk was back here. One window over here. That was where the whites were this window over here. There was a door that came in and I'm going right here. That's where the people came in if they were going to buy a ticket.
And you make a good point. Back then, we still had segregation.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
And so there was actually a waiting room for white people and a waiting room for black people.
That is absolutely right. And both had full toilet facilities and everything else. And
What did y'all do besides football and Boy Scouts?
Well, my friend Dave Patterson and I, he finally turned out to be a funeral director. During high school, he would help drive the ambulance. That way he could speed and not get picked up for speed. But we would, on his off time, we'd come down here and we'd get a quart of chocolate milk and drink it while or get a quart of whatever of lime sherbet, and we'd sit out back and just wait for something to come up.
Was there a dairy here where you got that, or was it a store, just a grocery store, or what was it?
Well, the grocery store, other than Lowe's Grocery or Bowden's Grocery, which were oversized 7-Elevens, we had to go to Sarasota to do grocery shopping. I don't know what it was, Quick Check or what it was called in those days. And we had the one bank, the Venice Nokomis Bank, which is now where Bank of America is, but it was one story. Well, I guess it was a two-story building. Somebody was telling me that it's a two-story building that one day they were cleaning some planks off in the second story, and they looked down and said, "What is that down there?" That's the vault. In other words, you could get to the vault through the ceiling.
Actually,
no particular problem.
I heard that story from Dan Boone, who had an office in there.
Yes.
When he moved out, they rolled up the carpet, and there was the entrance to the vault that he had not known about all that time.
That is a Dan Boone story. Well, at Rotary Club, they kid about Dan Boone and I. Somebody was doing a story on fossils and so forth, and they said this is back in the time when Grady Hough and Dan Boone first came. But in 1949, what was there to do here after hours, or not after hours, during hours? Well, you'd walk down to the Dick and Meadows, which was across the light. The bus station was on the northwest corner. It was also a gas station. The opposite corner was a gas station also.
Mm-hmm. Right on Tamiami Trail there.
The police station was on the northeast corner. And the football or baseball field was right behind that. The little theater, or now the theater, that was the KMI gym. Mm-hmm. So what did we do? Mostly on the weekend, you played baseball or whatever. They had a city team at that time. Sometime go to the beach where the girls were. I was a 5-letterman: football, basketball, baseball, track, and girls. I still worked with the Scouts here until, I don't know, sometime around, I guess my sophomore year. The scouting diminished because when you're playing multiple sports and trying to keep education going, you don't have a whole lot of time for, and I guess that was the thing, Pam. There wasn't a whole lot of time between working here and playing sports and doing the academic side of school. In the summertime, I was here, or Dad needed me to run to Punta Gorda or to Sarasota to do whatever errands had to be run. And after that, go home. If I had a date, I'd go out on the date. And he always used to say, because he gave me a long leash, he said, "Son, I never fully go to sleep until you're back home."
Oh, that's all parents, I think.
And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he would stay up all night long. One day I said, Daddy, why does Pop stay up all night? He says, I don't know. He says, maybe he's afraid if he goes to sleep, he won't wake up. I don't know. But I come up the stairs at our house up on the bay in Laurel, and here'd be Pop. He'd be asleep in his chair, and I didn't know it, but I guess Dad was waiting, still awake, waiting for me to come back up at 12 o'clock or maybe 1 o'clock sometime in the morning. But he, let me do whatever I did, and I guess I had good enough sense to behave myself most of the time because that's the way I'd been brought up.
And so now I remember you told me something about railroad employees had passes and they could get on the train and go someplace. So you used to get on that train and go far afield, didn't you?
Yeah, I rode the train up, as I say, to Washington, D.C., and then I'd get a pass going over to Pittsburgh. Because my wife and I first met when I was a senior and she was a junior in high school. She was down here just for, it was very cold here. They lived in Buffalo and her mother had certain arthritic type things, so it's not good to be in Buffalo in the wintertime. So they were down here for 3 or 4 months. That's where we met. So it was a long distance romance after they moved back to Buffalo and then to Pittsburgh. And I'd go up there once a year. I would take the train, but on all the years, I never rode the train down to the Y where it turned around. I never.
Oh, really?
But I had just finished unloading the train, and I was putting away the stuff. So why would I ride? Right. I don't know. It's like so many things in life. We look back and say, why didn't I take advantage of that?
So people who maybe don't know about that, after they came here to the train depot, to the freight place, and you unloaded it, what happened next?
It went down to what they call the Y, which must have been more of a U-shape because the train would go and back in and around and then come back pointed the opposite direction.
And where was that Y?
The Y was down close to where Center Road is. And you say, beyond that, since I never rode down there, I don't know exactly where it was. And it was right there. It's like going to visit some of the attractions in Florida. I've only been to Key West once in 125 years. My wife says I was born at 50, so I guess I'm 128 now.
So, well, it's been an interesting life for you in Venice, and you stayed here.
Well, when I was in college, and I knew I had military service coming up, because in those days, you didn't have an alternative. If you were male and could pass the physical, you went in the military. And I had not planned to go in the advanced ROTC in college, but my tactical officer convinced me to do it, so I wound up. I knew I wanted to come back to Venice. My father-in-law thought I was crazy. He says, how are you going to find a job? He had always worked for a big company, Westinghouse, and he couldn't perceive of the entrepreneurial spirit that I'd been raised around. And even though Dad worked for the railroad, he abided by the rules. In the early days, he would tell me stories about the railroad and some of the crazy things they would do up in North Florida. And I said, Daddy, that's kind of different than the way it is now. He says, yeah. He says, progress got in the way. You know, we no longer could horse around and, you know, sitting on the side of a trestle and somebody brings the train along and runs you and makes you jump off the trestle into the water, or all the crazy things. By the time, I guess I was in the cusp of when it was really beginning to get civilized, I remember restamping letterhead, because it was the Seaboard Airline, the Seaboard something else, restamping the letterhead to whatever the new name of it was, as railroads merged, separated, whatever. And at one time, I guess it became the Seaboard Coastline, which was 2 railroads when I was in Fort Myers.
And how much did you earn when you were doing that work?
Well, when I was official on the railroad payroll, I made $1.16 an hour in the later stages. I think Dad paid me $1 an hour when I was on his payroll. And back in, the interest rates were 1%. And how we've come back to the future now with interest rates at 1/10 of 1% right. At the bank.
That's right. Grady, before we quit, I want to talk about your dad's books. He wrote 2 books, Rhymes of a Railroad Man, and
More Rhymes of
More
a Railroad.
Rhymes. So there, you have a couple of favorites that I'd like you to read.
Well, I'm not going to try to interpret one of them. I'll bypass. I'll just give you the bottom line. That's the back in those days when they had separate churches as well as separate waiting rooms, and it's the Negro preacher who had just been fired saying his farewell address. Uncle Mo says farewell. And he talks about how he's raised all the families, he's baptized their children and so forth, and he wishes them all well, and as he goes down the aisle, to please observe the mistletoe tied to his coattail. Now that's one of the humorous ones, the one that I always like, because every time something difficult goes on, somebody that I've known for years has passed away, I've got Uncle Mo says, well, but it's got too much colloquialism, I can't, it's like when I can go up to Georgia now, I can't understand redneck that well anymore. But I can almost recite it by memory, but Pam taught me by unawares here, I don't have it. It's called Beachcomber. And I'll even paraphrase that, because life and living, death and dying, mortal tides which ebb and flow, begin and end when tide is lowest, be it high or low. And that the essence is, no matter how high the tide reaches, it isn't how high it went, but what it left behind. And that effectively is what all of this brings back to me.
Mm-hmm. So every time you think about what life means, you think about
it's
your
what we do today to make it a better place. And all the things that we did, all the honors, quote unquote, we received really came after the fact of what we'd already done. I know when I was working with the Scouts, I would get calls for years after I had effectively stopped working with the Scouts. It takes a long time to build the reputation until somebody says, hey, thank you, which is one of the 3 or 4 words, I guess, that we ought to use more. Please, thank you, and I love you.
Grady, I want to say thank you for being here today. It's been my pleasure to hear your stories. I wish I could hear more of them. We don't have much time left. We don't have any time left. But I appreciate you being on the show and all your great wisdom, knowledge, and history of Venice. And I look forward to seeing you again when we bring you more Venice Views.